There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's the early hours of September 1, 1988 in suburban Perth, and 8-year-old Crispian Chan stirs from his sleep to hear his father, panicked, on the phone. Through the walls of his bedroom, he can't quite make out what he's saying, but he knows it's bad. His dad quickly jumps in the car, leaving his sleeping sons and wife behind, and pulls up in front of the family business he runs alongside his twin brother. The Mann is a shell of its former self. Once a vibrant Chinese restaurant with iconic red carpets and lanterns hanging from the walls beneath a traditional curved roof, the now blackened building is emitting a toxic stench of burnt plastic and wood. Behind the yellow crime scene tape is a scene of charred tables, singed walls and shattered windows. The damage is extensive, $155,000 worth, and while the family has insurance on the building, the devastated Chan family will soon learn that they aren't covered for the loss of profits on their once thriving business. Their entire income stream dissipates overnight, everything they've worked for. But they aren't the only targets on that September morning. Another Chinese restaurant across town is also firebombed, kickstarting a campaign of terror targeting Perth's Chinese community. The motive behind the attacks is impossible to ignore: racially fuelled hatred. But it will take a drastic escalation of violence for WA police to start taking the firebombs seriously. As they finally start to piece the crimes together and close in on the culprits, police realise they've happened upon a plot in the making that's a whole lot more sinister than the destroying of restaurants. But to undo those responsible and stop the plans in their tracks, they'll have to rely on one of the firebombers themselves. A man willing to double-cross his gang to save his own skin. I'm Gemma and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. For Crispian Chan and his family, these attacks didn't just appear out of nowhere. He remembers walking to school and seeing street lamps, bus stops and shop walls plastered in racist posters. "Asians out or racial war," they read. It was no secret who was behind them. Their name was on it. The Australian Nationalist Movement, or ANM. They were a racist neo-Nazi group led by a man called Peter Joseph Jack Van Tongeren, and they were extremely vocal in their hatred for not just the Chinese community, but Jewish communities too. For years, their posters just became an accepted part of life in and around Perth. For the Chinese community, they weren't just words on a page. They were insults thrown in their faces on a daily basis. Once the firebombing started to escalate, police turned their attention to the activities of the ANM. They discovered that it wasn't just posters. It wasn't just attacks on Chinese restaurants. This gang was quite literally preparing for war. This was terrorism, a sustained and coordinated terrorism campaign. Crispian was determined to revisit the attack that destroyed his family's livelihood in the 80s, teaming up with ABC investigative reporter Alex Mann to retrace the steps of the original investigation. In their podcast, Firebomb, they traverse the country looking for answers as they tell a story shockingly underreported in Australia's history. They join me now. Crispian, let's start with you. Tell us about your parents and the life that they created for you and your brother in Western Australia.
So my parents both came to Australia at a relatively young age for themselves. Dad came over when he was about 10 or 12, and Mum came over in her late 20s. And they met each other in Perth working in a little Chinese restaurant themselves. Dad was a cook and mum was a waitress, and they kind of fell in love there, and they soon got married. And the interesting thing is that my dad's identical twin brother had also come over as well, and he met my mum's older sister, and so the two of them married as well. So we have a double marriage going on here.
It's like a movie.
It is, and it's a little bit surreal. We have a little in-joke with my cousin, and I talk about how we had the same genetic father. We're almost like half brothers and sisters in some ways. But in any case, you can say this is a real family business. So these two families joined together and they started up a restaurant in the early 80s, and that was the Mann Chinese restaurant. And so that was our family business, and that became our livelihood. That was what my parents worked in, day out, to create a life for us in Perth.
So growing up around the Mann, obviously with both parents working in a business, you would have, I'm assuming, been running around their feet, in and out of the business a lot. What was it like living your childhood there amongst the smells of the cooking and the people coming in to eat your parents' food?
Yeah, I would say this is like a very common scene with a lot of Chinese restaurants in suburbia in Australia. I definitely have lots of memories of doing my homework in the dining room on table one while mum and dad are cooking and serving the customers. Sometimes as kids, we'd answer the phone to take orders. I'd be sleeping in the pantry on the rice sacks. I'd be trying to teach myself how to cook on the stove. Dad would like give me all the offcuts of meat, and then I'd be just like pattering around on a wok, trying to copy what my dad's doing, who's doing it 20 times better than I am. So yeah, it was definitely my whole life did kind of come in and out of the restaurant. And my parents also became really good friends with the regulars. So we had a community at the restaurant as well, a lot of regular customers. My parents would know the orders before the customers even come in. So it was really part of my home, the Mann. It was not only a place of work, but also a home and a community.
You've painted a very idyllic picture, and I'm sure that there was hardship amongst that as well. But I do want to change tact a little bit and ask, did you experience a lot of racism growing up in that community?
It was always there. Definitely growing up, going through primary school, there were times where I remember getting into fights with kids. One that I remember as a very young kid in like year one, a boy who was, I have this vignette of him kneeling on my chest, and he was making slitty eyes with his fingers, and he was calling me a ching chong, and he had a very particular brown mullet, and he spat in my face. And it was a bit lonely also during lunchtime in that school, walking around, not really having many friends. Definitely outside, there were instances of racism. We'd have the odd customer coming in who'd make racist jokes. I know there was one time I remember someone coming in ordering flied lice in the restaurant and kind of using those kind of play on words in the restaurant, putting on funny accents on phones. You get weird crank calls on the phone when you're making orders, people trying to imitate the Chinese accent. So you had those floating around. But also during that time as well, we started seeing a lot of racist posters around Perth. I mean, especially from the mid-'80s onwards, we started seeing a lot of posters being posted around the streets and lampposts and bus stops. Posters saying Asians out or racial war, white revolution is the only solution, and other racist posters targeting other minorities as well. So that was something I remember growing up around. We even had some posters pasted on my parents' restaurant doors as well. Dad told me that he once caught some boys putting those posters up and then chasing them across the road into the car park in the shopping centre next door. So definitely there was this undercurrent of racism that was going through in that period.
Alex, I'm going to bring you in here because you've been working alongside Crispian, reinvestigating what happened to his family's restaurant and what happened after that. But what's your take on the mood in Perth during this time when it came to how they treated Chinese communities more broadly?
I guess it's difficult to kind of make a big generalisation. I think from speaking to Crispian and his family, you get a sense that they're so head down on their mission of providing for their family and making sure that their businesses were successful that it was almost like they had the blinkers on. You might have registered that there was this stuff out there, but the extent to which it was important with the main primary concerns of your life, it was lower down the order. But that doesn't mean it's not frightening. So what was the mood like in the community? The impression that we get from speaking to people who were there at the time, particularly younger people, I think might have registered this unease a little more deeply. They talk about seeing those posters. They talk about recognizing that those posters were targeting them. They talk about seeing the face of the man behind these posters on the news, being interviewed, being almost given this status and legitimacy through their eyes by seeing him on the television, and that being a really frightening thing. And then you would hear those same sorts of comments in the playground. And so whilst I think police and a lot of politicians and even large sections of the media weren't joining the dots between the experience of the Chinese community on the streets, these posters that were popping up everywhere, the Chinese restaurants being set on fire, and then this guy and his group, the Australian nationalist movement. I think for a lot of the Chinese community, the connective tissue between those four things was, really strong and really obvious. But for a lot of other people, they were almost looked at as these distinct and quite separate phenomena.
Crispian, can you take us to the night that this happened at your family's restaurant? So it's September 1, 1988. From your perspective, what did happen that night in the early hours?
Well, I was only 8 years old when the firebombing happened. So my memories of it come in little tableaus. I remember first hearing the phone call in the middle of the night. It was about 2 a.m. or something like that. And I'm in bed and I hear my dad answering the phone. He swears and rushes out and drives to the restaurant. And then the next memory jumps to me stopping at the restaurant in the morning on the way to school. And it was something like a scene out of a movie for me, seeing this restaurant that had been burnt out. There was crime scene tape around the scene. So for me, it was like something from a cop show or something like that. And I remember seeing the Chinese lanterns melting from the ceiling down. They were like stalactites, and me picking up a tumbler that had been blackened from the smoke. But the interesting thing was I don't remember much about my parents explaining to me what had happened to that time. I think my parents really were still trying to work out what was happening. And at that point, definitely it didn't occur to my parents that this possibly could have been a racist attack. As far as they thought, it could have been a gas leak at that particular moment on that day. So it was this weird thing, I was very excited about this scene, but not realizing the gravity of what had actually just happened.
Have you talked to your dad in retrospect? Because he was the first one that arrived on the scene in those early hours once he got the call. Have you talked to him in retrospect about how he felt seeing what had happened to his business?
I have recently started only to talk to my father about all of this. And to be honest, and that's been one of the things in the journey in this podcast, is really uncovering that history of my family again, because it was something that my parents never really shared with me growing up about their feelings. In fact, one of the very first instances of me hearing about how they actually felt about that time, that period, was actually watching a TV interview that Mum did in like the 90s, where a reporter asked her, how did you feel about your restaurant being firebombed? And she was like, I'm feeling very scared and frightened. I mean, that was the first time I've actually ever heard my parents talk about anything relating to themselves and emotion. So, talking to my dad now, he did say that initially at that point that, they were just confused, really. At that point, we were the second restaurant of the first night of these firebombing attacks. So there were 5 Chinese restaurants that were attacked. The first restaurant was a Chinese city restaurant, and then we were hit next. So at that point, this whole firebombing campaign against Chinese restaurants had only just started. The connections had not necessarily been made yet by the police. It was very clear, though, that there was something very suspicious that these 2 restaurants were firebombed on the same night. But its intent at that point wasn't quite clear. So for my parents, to them, it could have easily been something that was to do with just a bunch of drunken hooligans, or simply, at one stage, my dad said, maybe we left the gas on before we closed the restaurant. So it was generally confusion that night. It did not dawn upon them at that point that this was actually a racially motivated attack.
I might get you, Alex, to explain a bit further what was happening from the police side of things, because obviously they've had 2 calls in one night for restaurants that have been, we now know, firebombed. Were they linking things? Were they suspecting arson? They're not going to share everything with the victims of the crime. Do we know what was going on behind the scenes?
The police, to begin with, were almost taking the same approach as the family. They were wondering, could this have been an accidental fire? Could this have been something that somebody did deliberately? And if it was deliberately lit, why would they have chosen to torch this restaurant and this other one on the same night, same type of business, another Chinese restaurant on the other side of Perth? That's pretty interesting. As they sort of started zeroing in on the scene, they have this standard practice of investigating any kind of fire, which is just to set up a perimeter and start working in towards the centre of the fire source. And when we started talking to the detectives from the WA arson squad who investigated the fire at Crispian's parents' restaurant, they said that it very quickly became apparent that it was a deliberately lit fire. What they found was evidence of an accelerant that had been introduced, in this case petrol, and they'd seen these rivulets down the window frame, which suggested that something had been thrown at the window, that it had run down and had ignited from there. So they were thinking, somebody's deliberately lit this fire. Next question is why? And at that point, I think when you talk to people who were aware of what the A&M was doing at that time, this is the Australian Nationalist Movement, a street-level neo-Nazi group at that point, setting up all of these posters all over the place, they thought, looks very much like something they would do. But as one of the police officers we spoke to said, he said, you know, here is suspicion and way over there is evidence. And so to begin with, they had to really chase down all of these other possible explanations for why these 2 Chinese restaurants would have been attacked. And they were throwing up possibilities like maybe they've got an irate customer who, you know, really didn't like the meal. Are there triad gangs that are operating some sort of extortion racket in the area? And that was a legitimate concern. There were triad gangs. They knew that they were active in Perth at that time, and so this was an avenue worth exploring. But there was no evidence to support that theory. And so very quickly the police started to hone in on their other theory, which was that there was this racist group out there who were putting out these posters saying Asians out or racial war. And now we've got these 2 Chinese restaurants that have been set on fire at the same time. Maybe they're connected.
Can I get you to just explain, for those of us who don't know, what actually is a triad gang?
It's organised crime. So this is an organised criminal gang. We've got bikies here in Australia, the ones that people know the most. You've got, you know, the mafia in Italy, and throughout parts of Asia you have triad gangs. And these gangs were operating in Australia at that time, probably still are. I haven't done a lot of investigative journalism into the operations of the triads in Australia, but they're probably still there. And an extortion racket is essentially just coming into a certain geographic area and basically saying, you want to do business here? Well, we control this area, so we're going to take a cut. And if you don't give us our cut, we will torch your restaurant, we'll destroy your business, we'll, you know, break your kneecaps, whatever it is that the particular triad modus operandi is, but there are consequences and they're not very nice. And so here in Australia, I think probably the most visible form of that kind of extortion racket is often around tattoo parlours. If you ever see a tattoo parlour go up in smoke in Australia, there's often a connection to some sort of bikie-controlled territory. There have been many examples of this in various states of Australia. So it happens across different organised criminal networks. The triads were no different, and the police, I think, were right to begin with to suspect that these 2 things could be connected. It was definitely like a valid line of inquiry.
They did quickly change their direction more solidly towards the Australian nationalist movement. Who were they more broadly? Like, what was the A&M?
All right, so Australian nationalist racism throws up these groups every now and again, people who take the worst brand of Australian nationalism and take it to its totally extreme conclusion. And the Australian nationalist movement publicised itself as this, you know, group of well-meaning, like-minded patriots who were dedicated to the White Australia policy, among other things, but they took it way further and they advocated for an end to Asian migration. They talked about the Zionist occupationist government, which is a Nazi conspiracy theory, which is against the Jewish community. It says all of the banks and government are kind of controlled by a Jewish cabal. They subscribe to that idea. And that gives you sort of, I guess, a little taste of the ideological underpinning of this group. But what they were actually doing on a day-to-day level was meeting up in the city. They were going on marches through the Central Mall, all dressed together with Jack Van Tongeren with his well-groomed moustache, his little comb-over, his military-style uniform. And they would sort of flex in an intimidatory way their presence in public spaces. They would put up these posters all over the city. They would intimidate anybody who tried to take them down. If you read Jack Van Tongeren's version of events, he says he put up 400,000 of these posters over about 4 or 5 years in Perth. I mean, even if that's total bullshit and you want to take a zero off the end of that, that's still 40,000 posters. That's still a hell of a lot of posters. And if you ask anybody who grew up in Perth during this period, they all remember the posters. You couldn't miss them, they were everywhere. And so the A&M was this group that was an outwardly racist, neo-Nazi group, making no effort to hide themselves, publicising their presence all over the city.
Is it legal to put up posters like that are directly targeted at people?
Well, it was. I mean, you had to be careful about what you stuck it to because that was where the offence became an issue. You would probably still see those signs around every now and again saying, post no bills. Have you seen those around in the city?
Yeah.
Every now and again, saying basically don't put up your band promo poster here, put it somewhere else. That this is private property, therefore you're not allowed to put it up there. That was the only offence that existed back then that prohibited this kind of activity. There was no incitement to racial hatred bill. There was no hate crimes at that stage. And so what was on the poster was not actually criminalised. It was the act of postering that was criminalised. And the offence was really minor. The penalty was like $150 or something like that. Would have been an infringement notice rather than an indictable offence. And so the consequences for these guys were absolutely minimal.
What's the incredible thing as well with those posters was that the A&M actually had a contact address on those posters. But even that, you couldn't actually be indicted for putting those posters on unless you were actually caught in the act of doing it physically yourself.
Yeah.
So even just having the postal address wasn't enough for the police to charge them with anything for putting those posters up. They had to be caught in the act of putting it up, which was incredible.
Hearing you explain that, it actually feels quite mind-blowing that people are just allowed to do that and there's no real consequences.
I mean, it is mind-blowing. It is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, the thing that you try to get across in this story is like what it would have been like to walk the streets of Perth at that time and see these things everywhere. And the fact that they were everywhere gives this impression that somebody is okay with them being there. And I think for many, many residents of Perth at that time, it wasn't just ugly, it was scary and it felt like something needed to happen. But if you were a member of the Asian community, a lot of the people we spoke to said that they were looking around kind of second guessing everybody. Do you approve of the posters? Do you approve of the posters? And the effect of this is just to create a culture of fear across the city. But it was only targeting minority groups and primarily the Asian community of Perth. And I think maybe the extent to which that was a frightening and awful experience just didn't pierce the mentality of politicians and police at that time until much later on when the criminality of the group and their propensity for violence became clearer.
Over the next few months after the two attacks that we've touched on, there were a number of other attacks. So by early 1989, there were 5 restaurants in total that had been firebombed and many, many more that had been vandalised. Crispian, Do you remember it ramping up at all? Do you remember a sense of fear or feeling like something was going on?
Well, my parents definitely did felt something was going on. And I know that the Chinese restaurant community in Perth back then was quite close-knit. Almost everyone knew who else was working in which restaurant. And there were definitely a number of attacks that happened in the following months after that. And definitely it became very clear that there was a very clear racially motivated intent for these attacks. So I know that there was a lot of conversations among the restaurant owners. There was even at one point a meeting that was held at the Chunghwa Association, which is the kind of community group for the Chinese community, where the police came in to talk to restaurant owners, to give them updates about what was going on. So there was clearly a sense of being under threat, of a danger to their livelihoods, and they needed the authorities to do more. And also during that period, there was also another attack that happened called Stronach, which happened a few months after the first few attacks. Around January it happened, and that was, how do we describe it? It's a homage.
Yeah, it was a throwback to a particular, the translation of the German of Kristallnacht is like Night of the Broken Glass. And it's something weirdly that neo-Nazis even today love to kind of try and replicate. It was unusual to see that this was what they were doing with the A&M at this point, because it's something that I've seen the present generation, today's guys trying to replicate as well. But they went around and drove to, it was about 6 different Chinese restaurants and, threw bricks through the windows. So there were fire attacks, yes, but there were also attacks like this. And that just adds to that fear in the Chinese community, and particularly in the restaurant community that you were talking about, Crispian.
And also, I suspect, and this is from hearing from my parents' friends who've shared a few stories, there was probably a lot more of these examples of bricks being thrown through glass, posters being put against walls during this period that have never been reported. I know my family, 2 of our friends have mentioned that during that time they did experience posters and bricks being thrown through windows, but they just didn't think it was something that the police would really care about, so they didn't bother reporting it. They just basically just called the insurance company and got the windows replaced. So there's probably a lot more that was happening then at the same time that we don't hear about.
Was the media reporting on this at the time?
Some. Well, Crispian and I went to the State Library here in Perth, and we went looking for what the media coverage was like at the time. And there's not a lot. There's not a lot. And what you see actually is small coverage of the damage to property, perhaps a line or two about suspicions towards anti-Asian activists is the term that pops up in the newspaper a little bit, without explicitly naming the Australian nationalist movement. Perhaps that's for legal reasons. But you can imagine that if something like this happened today, you can imagine on, say, the Saturday edition of the paper, there would be some sort of feature article, where a journalist might have spent the week talking to Chinese restaurant owners, and they would have got a feel for how the community is reacting to this spate of fires. We're not saying we know who did it. We're not saying that it was the Australian nationalist movement, but you can imagine that an article could be written that would sort of group together these fears and connect it to this spate of anti-Asian hate that's been spreading across the city. But that stuff is just not in the coverage. There is no connection being made in the media prior to the arrests of the firebombers about the connection between all of these things. That's really surprising. I mean, maybe it's not surprising, but it's not good to see. A slightly more sympathetic interpretation of this would be that we know, and it's still the case for us today when we did this podcast, is that it's really hard to have people who were directly affected by this at the time from the Chinese community to speak about what they went through publicly. That's been quite hard for us. It's been very hard even for Crispian to be making those kind of connections with people that he even has family connections to. And so I imagine that a predominantly white media in Perth would have really struggled to make those connections. Secondly, we know that the police at the time, they had their suspicions that it was the A&M, but they weren't going out there and jeopardising their investigation by broadcasting it publicly that they thought that the A&M was behind it. So that, I think, would have limited the kinds of stories that journalists could have written. That doesn't mean that you can't write any story, and that's what we found, that there were almost no stories. And then I guess if you take it a little bit further, what you did end up finding as the escalating violence became more public and the threat to the community became worse, Van Tongeren, the leader of the Australian nationalist movement, was looking for ways to get himself into the media any way he could. He ran for parliament a couple of times.
How did that go?
Poorly, but if you think that the goal is getting elected, and I don't think that was the goal. He wouldn't have ever thought that he was seriously a chance of getting elected. So how did it go for him? Probably quite well, because what he did do was get a shitload of media attention for what he was doing. He got to say all sorts of racist stuff into a microphone, which was broadcast to the entire population of Western Australia. And he got to let anybody know in WA who felt in any way anxious about Asian migration that here was this guy that had their backs and that maybe there was something more to it than just, a bit of anxiety. You should come and join our movement. We're going to do something about it. And I think that was the goal. And that's, when people talk about platforming, that's what it was. And I don't think people at that time were very alert to the consequences of providing a guy like that a platform like that.
Alex, you've written about the fact that the WA police force itself might have been quite sympathetic to the A&M. That's not going to really help things at the time. Can you extend on that?
I think it's probably unfair to say that, that the WA police force was racist, but the WA police force was reflective of the WA community. And, its members were drawn from that community. And what you did find is that early on in that period, before the Chinese restaurant bombings really took off, is that I don't think anybody was really taking it very seriously. You didn't see that sense that, okay, here's a group that we understand to be a threat. And so that as soon as that restaurant, that first, second, third, even fourth restaurant is lit, that you know who's done it and you're going over to their house straight away. And I think, even if you speak to the police officers who were members of the arson squad who led that investigation into the A&M, one of them said to us, perhaps to begin with, we didn't really grasp what they were capable of. And he said, terrorism wasn't even really a word that we used back then to describe this sort of thing, which with our post-September 11, hats on, we think, what do you mean you didn't think about this as terrorism? Well, it just wasn't in people's thinking in the same way that it is today. Eventually, the judge who ended up convicting Van Tongeren labelled it as terrorism. They knew the word was there. People knew how to apply it. This was terrorism. But I think perhaps early on, this group of activists saying these awful things in such an awful and public way, it's like the alarm bells didn't ring for perhaps a longer period of time than they would have today.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with reporter Crispian and investigative journalist Alex Mann about a spate of firebombings that plagued Chinese restaurants in Perth in the 1980s. Up next, we'll explore the firebombing attack that finally led police to capture the perpetrators of these attacks. I want to skip to May 1989 because that's when the coasting Chinese restaurant was attacked, actually for a second time. What was different about that attack?
This attack was different basically straight from the beginning. The police ended up arriving at the restaurant and they noticed that there had been entry to the building, which was unusual because the previous fires had basically they'd broken a window and thrown a Molotov cocktail through the window, introduced these accelerants and then done a runner from there. This one, they could see that there'd been forced entry into the building. And as they did their usual perimeter and started going in towards the source of the fire, they realized, first of all, there was this awful, thick, cloying smell, which for the arson squad detectives was a very familiar smell. The smell of plastic explosive. It would give you a headache straight away as soon as you walked in. They did these, as they were doing the inside searches of the crime scene, they had to do it in 10-minute shifts because the guys were getting such a bad headache as they walked into the building. They ended up quarantining sections of the building with this pink crime scene tape in these little 1 square meter blocks. And then they just went through it methodically through the restaurant. And as they did, they started discovering all of these other things that were different too. There were the floor, the walls, the ceiling, everything was pockmarked with these, small shards of metal. It looked like something had propelled this metal outwards at great force. At this point, they still didn't know what that was, so they're sort of tiptoeing closer and closer to the center of the room, at which point they find this small crater in the concrete slab of the restaurant floor where a huge explosive had gone off. And as they kind of look up at the ceiling, they could see that the roof itself had been blown up and chairs had been stuck underneath the roof where the roof had sort of separated from the walls, gone up off the walls. Chairs had been blown outwards, got stuck underneath the roof as the roof fell back down again and got squashed. So they were looking up at the walls thinking, bloody hell, how did those chairs get there underneath the roof? And so what they were able to figure out after sending off a bunch of samples to the labs is that a mining explosive had been set off in the middle of the room, that it had been wrapped with fencing wire in some sort of improvised explosive device, and that fencing wire had separated into shrapnel and just shredded the inside of the restaurant. And for a lot of the police, they thought that this meant that now it became a protection of life. They were really worried that this sort of device could hurt someone if the restaurant itself had people in it. If you think that the police were complacent up until this point, this really, really changed the game. From here on, everybody was on the same page. There was a real sense of urgency. There was pressure from the politicians. There was pressure from the police commissioner, pressure from the community. The cops were absolutely under the pump from this point onwards. And I think they were also putting themselves under a great deal of pressure because they were scared that a lot of people could really get hurt.
So the man on the ground for that one, obviously he has the gang behind him, but Russell Willey, we know he was responsible for that attack. He has since spoken to a documentary crew and given his insights, his excuses, his experiences of that night. You've both listened to that in full. Crispian, how did you feel listening to that?
Listening to Russell Willey in that documentary was a really interesting insight into the types of people who will join an organization like the A&M and other groups like that. I think what really struck me about Russell Willey, he joined the A&M based on an argument he had with an Asian driver who had parked in his parking bay. He was so incensed by that he saw a poster nearby which A&M had posted and decided to call up and join the group, which I thought was a really interesting kind of insight into the way that these people kind of process their anger or whatever tensions that they have into something like this. I think another interesting story about Russell was that he actually lived very close to the restaurant that he bombed. And in fact, it was his wife's favorite restaurant.
Crispian, what was his quote? He's like, I lived nearby, and it was a shame because I used to go there with the missus and she thought it was good tucker.
It's just fascinating.
You have to laugh because what the hell?
Right.
I mean, when you listen to him talk about those little anecdotes, it just blows my mind about this man. But it also, in some ways, I'm not surprised in that in the end, he was the one that turns on the group. But it is chilling. It's absurd. I actually funnily just find myself laughing sometimes when I think about that conversation. But it is also very chilling at the same time, hearing the inside of this man. But I also felt that it was also very clear that he was an opportunist, really a criminal first for me than anything else. He says he's a political soldier in the documentary. I think he was an opportunist because I think, the moment he felt the heat, he turned on the group. That doesn't come across as a man who has a strong belief in his ideology or his political beliefs. I think it was a man who did whatever he could to make a quick buck. That's just my own personal opinion about when I hear of Russell Willey.
So Russell helped to kind of inform Operation Jackhammer, which was the police's plan to take down the A&M. Can you walk us through what that plan was, Alex?
Yeah. How all this stuff unraveled, it's so fascinating because it's something that I think actually evaded us even when we began investigating this. You would assume that because the threat to the public was the fires, that it would be an investigation into the fires that would yield the key piece of evidence that would take you to the culprits, and then that would be the end of the investigation. But that's not how it happened at all. And it's that actually Russell Willey is the one that provides this missing piece. And it's not even the arson squad that uncovers it. It's the break and enter squad who get this tip off from some guy who had been to the races and, had been picked up by the cops for something else. And to try to enhance his position, as it was put to me, he said, I know a guy. And they said, well, there's this guy down at the races trying to palm off all of this electrical equipment. His name's Russell Willey. He says he's got a ton of it at this stash house. I'll show it to you if you let me off on this other charge. And so the cops are like, all right, well, let's go check out this house then. So they go and check out the house. Sure enough, it's absolutely rammed full of electrical gear. They secrete themselves inside the house. They close it back up again. And then they just wait for like a day and a half. Eventually, they hear the sound of this car come in the driveway. They see the lights kind of flash up on the curtains. It's like, all right, go time, fellas. Here we go. So they grabbed them, got sort of Jack Van Tongeren's right-hand man, a guy called John Van Blitterswyk, and Russell Willey were the two guys who walked through the house in that moment. Van Blitterswyk was a hardened criminal. He was not for turning. And Russell Willey was this opportunist who'd kind of found a way to make money with this group. And instantly the police were thinking, he's our guy. We got to try to get to him. And so they left him in the watch house overnight. He got intimidated. There were some Asian men in the watch house at the time who basically kind of came up to him, and Russell realized that they were going to beat the hell out of him and that he was, in danger. He's thinking he's got a wife and a kid on the outside. He really, really doesn't want to go to jail. And the police say to him, oh, well, we found this other break that we think you were involved in. It was about a $60,000 break. And we're going to pin you for it, but just you. So you're going to take the hit for it. Sorry, mate. And he was saying, well, this is outrageous. The stakes were too high for him. And he said, well, look, I've got some information for you. I think I could probably help you out with your Australian nationalist movement inquiries. And it's from that point onwards that Russell starts to sing. He agrees to wear a wire. He goes back into the A&M. He goes out on they had this base. It's like a paramilitary base sort of thing out in the bush, about an hour and a half north of Perth. He went out there with them when they were on the firing range. He gave the cops all of this information about where the group had been stashing these caches of firearms across the city. They were burying them in big green wheelie bins. They had firearms and explosives and like their balaclavas and military fatigues stashed in these bins, buried in public parks all over the city. When they say like Asians out or racial war, it's like they really were preparing for some kind of war. And Willey's evidence and his briefings that he was giving to the police based on these recordings that he was making allowed the cops to neutralise all these different things. They were building a case against the A&M based on what Willey was saying. They were corroborating everything that he was saying by raiding the various places, getting evidence of the break and enters that they were doing. They'd had no idea that whilst the A&M had been on this firebombing spree that was actually almost dwarfed in scale by their thievery spree, this set of burglaries that they'd done across the city, more than a dozen in, 5 months or so. It was almost like one every week or two. Seriously big breaking into burglaries. And eventually Willie gave them enough, what they needed to go and raid this paramilitary base that they had up in a small town called Bindoon, which is just over an hour north of Perth. And that was what they called Operation Jackhammer. And that's how the group came undone.
When you listen to this story in chronological order, yes, the firebombs sound horrible and terrifying, and then there's the posters. But then when it opens up and you start to see that they've got this paramilitary base and they've got guns in bins, and it's so much bigger of an operation than you kind of imagine it's going to be at the start, and it actually opens up to be so much more shocking than you could ever imagine.
I definitely remember getting a sense of that enormity of just how big this was during the time when the trials happened. So after Operation Jackhammer, I think it was in 1990, so a year later or so, that's when the trial started. And my parents actually would get me to record all the news footage of the trial, covering all that, and they were also collecting press clippings of that. And that, was when I think the whole community, for the first time as well, really got a sense of just how far these guys went with their anti-Asianization and what they wanted to do to change things. So that really was quite chilling to hear. I think that was also the first time for me, I was about 10 years old by that point, that I actually kind of understand that this whole thing was racially motivated and that this was, racism at its most ugliest.
What I found interesting as well is in his sentencing, Jack Van Tongeren saying, well, we did it at night so that we didn't injure anyone. When they had guns, they had plans, they had, these bigger ideologies as well.
Jack always says, I'm not a terrorist, and that, we never set out to hurt anybody, which is such a ridiculous minimization of the effect of what he and his group did in Perth over a number of years. The judge found it was terrorism. It was designed to terrorize, and the way that kind of terrorism works is to embolden people. It legitimizes violent acts motivated by racism, and for a lot of people, it will even make them feel like those acts are important to do and that they should be doing them because it's the right thing to do. That's what this sort of stuff does. That's what it did in Perth. And there were some absolutely horrific stories that we heard from people who were experiencing the kind of everyday violent racist attacks that you wouldn't have been able to say, well, that was committed by the A&M, that was on the orders of Jack Van Tongeren. No, it just was happening more at that time. There was a review at the time as well, in the years subsequent, that found that there was a direct correlation, a causal link between those posters and the racist attacks. So I'm not just saying it because I think it's probably true. There was a review, and that's what it found.
We did interview the wife and daughter of this Chinese, Malaysian, Australian taxi driver, Peter Tan, who was bashed to death in early 1988. And when the police arrested the young man who had committed the assault, during the interview, he was asked why he had done it, and he said that it was because he was Chinese, because he hated Chinese people. And so he thought he'd give him a thrashing for it.
So he wasn't linked to the A&M, was he, that man?
He wasn't. But, as Alex mentioned, when you have messages out there that aren't being addressed and people being emboldened by campaigns such as these racist posters being put around and the platforming that they were getting, it unfortunately has consequences like that. And what happened to Peter Tan is probably the worst case scenario for our community in what happens when racism is not addressed.
Jack and his crew were convicted for what they did during this time. They were convicted of more than 150 offences. Jack himself went to prison. Well, he was sentenced to 18 years. He served 12 and then he was released on bail. And then the attacks started again. And it wasn't Jack, but it was people inspired by Jack. But meanwhile, Jack is conspiring to attack again. It's all very confusing, but you find out that Jack and his crew were planning to attack your family restaurant again, Crispian. That must have been terrifying.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I remember the moment when Jack came out of jail. I remember seeing the newspapers, the press, they made a big thing, but he made the front pages of the newspapers when he came out. It was this big headline that said unrepentant. He made that very clear that coming out of jail after 12 years, he clearly not changed his views. And that was really chilling to see, and see that he seemed like he was ready to start something again. So when the news of the 3 restaurants were firebombed a year or two later, when we heard that, I was actually in the middle of a rehearsal for a children's theatre show that I was working on called Hidden Dragons, which coincidentally was a show that talked about a young Chinese Australian boy called Brendan who was being haunted by these dragons in his dreams that represented his Chinese culture, and he's haunted by his Chinese grandmother who's saying, why are you trying to suppress your Chinese identity? And it's about him growing up in Australia and experiencing racism as a child, and him trying to assimilate and in some ways try and work out his cultural identity. And then a week before we opened this show, these Chinese restaurants were attacked. And the first thing that crossed my mind when I heard about these attacks was like, shit, this Jack Van Tongeren doing things all over again. And that's the first thing my family thought. I think that's the whole thing our whole community thought was this Jack Van Tongeren starting his deja vu again? This is the thing. This time around, the police acted very quickly. And within weeks, they had caught the people that had done it. And what surprised us was that it wasn't actually the Jack Van Tongeren at A&M. It was actually these other people that were inspired. So that was a bit of a shock in that it wasn't them. But then to follow up here later on that they were convicted for conspiracy to arson, to planning to firebomb a restaurant, including our restaurant. I think what shocked us was also because it was actually a marketing campaign. It came out that actually this whole conspiracy to arson was actually Jack Van Tongeren planning to firebomb some of the restaurants that he had actually previously firebombed again as a way to promote this book that he had written in prison about his exploits in the 80s. So that was all just this absurd and just mind-blowing as well, the fact that this was actually a marketing campaign for this man.
What ended up happening to Jack? Where is he now?
That's what we wanted to know. That's what we were trying to find out. If you look at the immediate answer to that question after he was convicted, to me, one of the real jaw-drop moments of this whole story is Jack Van Tongeren gets convicted of conspiracy to commit arson for a second time, this time, against the same restaurants, same guys, same twisted racist ideology to motivate it. He gets arrested. He gets released on bail, which is wild in and of itself, but he does. Whilst on bail, he does a runner, and he's on the run for 6 weeks outside, in the bush somewhere in Western Australia. They find him. They bring him back. He goes before the courts. He gets convicted, but because there's been about 2 years of arrest and time spent on remand, he gets released on time served on the condition that he leave Western Australia. And so Jack left. And there's very little trace of Jack online since then. He had some family in Victoria. We understand he went over there for a while. The most visible traces of Jack ever since he left Western Australia are his paintings. Because Jack, I don't know if he learnt to do it in Vietnam or if he learnt to do it as a child in art school or maybe in his jail cell, but he's a pretty good painter. He's not bad. And he used to paint these landscapes and exhibit them. And so online you could find these traces of Jack's exhibitions. There were some in Victoria, some in regional South Australia. And by matching up the timelines on these exhibitions, we started to get a bit of a clearer idea of where Jack had been living and where he was living now. We then also found some people that Jack had been writing Christmas cards to. And on the back of these Christmas cards was a post office box. Now, it's not a very specific address, a post office box, but it starts to give you, again, a bit of a clearer picture of where in Australia this person might be living. And we found that Jack was living in outback South Australia. Once we had the suburb or the nearest town for the PO box, we did a number of other searches, made a few more phone calls, and managed to find a home address. And so at the end of our investigation, we went to try and find Jack, to try and answer the question, to try to actually to speak to him. I won't say whether or not we got to speak with Jack, but I can tell you that on the way there, we were pretty nervous about what he was up to. We'd seen in closed Telegram chat groups evidence of present-day neo-Nazis trying to get in touch with Jack. We'd had somebody who knew him quite well say to us that he was out there training the next generation, whatever that means. And we were really toey about going out to this bush block in the middle of nowhere to catch up with a guy who's got a track record of setting up really dangerous places on bush blocks in the middle of nowhere. I mean, when we finally did get out there, I mean, I won't say whether or not we got to speak with Jack. I mean, tune into the podcast because that part of it is totally wild. But we did manage to figure out that it doesn't seem like Jack is out there training the next generation. You know, these things were concerning and they're definitely worth checking out. But it does seem like Jack is just out there keeping to himself. Who knows what's going on in his head these days? But it certainly doesn't seem like he's out there, you know, planning the next set of firebombing attacks against Chinese restaurants. You know, it seems like he's living a quiet hermit life on this bush block out in the middle of nowhere in South Australia.
Crispian, I want to end with you. You've obviously had to dig deep into your own personal experiences, your family's experiences, your community's experiences to tell this story, and to kind of lean into a lot of the racist ideology that was being said and continues to be said about your community today. What are you hoping that people take away from listening to this story in a modern day setting?
I think it's important for us to remember this particular event that happened in Perth in the 80s. I think it's a story that hasn't been told in its full entirety. I think we've heard a lot about the exploits of the A&M. We've heard a lot about what the police and the government did. But what we haven't really heard in this story, and you know, this is on a community level and my own personal level, was hearing the stories about the people that went through it, the other Chinese restaurants, the migrant families, the Chinese community at that point. That was a very young Chinese community post-white Australia policy. And what we haven't really told is the Australian Chinese, Australian Asian side of this period. And I think it's a very important part of our history. I think it's part of Australia's here, but also our community's history. And I want to use this as a way to kind of help balance the retelling, but also to understand the lessons that we should have taken from that. I think that in some ways, with the recent rise in activities with the far right, with the visibility of neo-Nazis in Australia, it feels like in some ways maybe there are signs that like this could maybe happen again. Like as Alex mentioned before, that the current neo-Nazis are currently even talking about that time, which Jack did. And we want to take control of that narrative. I think Jack has a particular viewpoint of what they did and how the impact is measured. But I also think that was something that also wasn't quite true, what he thinks happened. I think it was a very unsuccessful. What they set out to achieve didn't happen. As you can see, just how much our community has grown, how much we've become a part of Australia. And I think it's about taking control of that narrative and telling the real kind of side of what really happened back then.
Thanks to Crispian and Alex for assisting us to tell this story. If you'd like to hear their full investigation of this case, including details of what happened when they tracked down Jack Van Tongeren, their podcast Firebomb is linked in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast, hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Moylan. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.